Welcome back to the How to Podcast series. It's Dave here with you. How are you doing? Are you doing good? I'm good. Thank you for asking. I'm good too. I had a comment come in on the podcast and I wanted to jump on here right away and respond. And it sparked an idea for a new episode here on the How to Podcast series. So, as I promise, if you leave me a message, whether it's through your listening app, Spotify has some really cool ways to respond to polls, respond to questions within the podcast. They're there for you. And if you kind of just like, what is this thing? It comes back to me as the host and I get to see your comments and feedback and then create an episode for you just like today. So use those questions, use those polls. They're there for a reason. They're not to annoy you. They're to bring feedback to me so we can make a better episode for you. I'm doing it, as Brian Adams would say, everything I do for you. Yeah, it's true. So today we're looking at hook, line, and listen, crafting compelling podcast introductions based on a question from you, the listener, on the podcast. You ready? Here we go. So we got a question in on the podcast from a past episode, and it's great. It was for an episode where it was a Daily Dave, and we talked about the Facebook and Instagram were down and can't reach my community, and that we need a website. And in there, my question at the end of it was, do you have a topic suggestion for our next show? Share your question here, and thanks for listening. And Rach left a question for us all. And it says, I'm starting a podcast, and although I listen to many podcasts, so it should be easy, I can't think of how I should start each episode. I'm freezing, and I keep putting it off. Rach, this episode is just for you, and I hope you enjoy, and I hope it helps. And again, Rach, if you ever have a question or a suggestion, or you just want to talk beyond listening to an episode of the How to Podcast series, on my website, howtopodcast.ca, there's a calendar link. You and I can jump on Zoom together, have a conversation, and I'd love to talk and help you through your starting of your episode and working through your intro. And that's kind of the idea for this is let's talk about how we start our episodes. And again, using a fishing analogy, because I am a mildly good fisherman, fisher guy. I am not an expert. I'm really good at fishing from a dock. I'm not really a good swimmer, so I don't do boats very well. Interesting behind the scenes there, Dave. But I love fishing because it is so relaxing. But there's a method. If you want to catch fish, you want to catch a lot of fish, there's some things you can do. And if you don't want to catch anything, there's some things you can do as well. So we want to catch listeners with our podcast right from the beginning. When they press play, we want them to hook in and we want them to stay. I tell everybody that my goal from my podcast, every episode, and sometimes I do it well, sometimes I need more practice, is to get you as a listener to put your phone away. So what I try to do is jump into the content as soon as possible. But here we go. We're going to talk about hook, line, and listen, crafting compelling podcast introductions, and we got a lot to talk about. So I'm excited for this. Research reveals that podcasts experience a really noticeable drop-off in listenership, ranging from about 20 to 35% within the first 5 minutes. Okay, now if you talk YouTube side, seconds, milliseconds, people will bounce from your content if it doesn't catch them right away. There is value in crafting an engaging podcast intro. It becomes really evident. Failing to captivate your audience within this critical time frame can lead to a lost listenership for your audience. Okay, Dave, how do we do this? Crafting an impactful podcast intro. Are you ready? A compelling podcast introduction should not only introduce your podcast and its purpose, but you can also entice both new and existing listeners. I think that's the one thing that we fail to recognize, especially if we've been doing this for a while, is that there are new listeners showing up today in your episode 132. They've never been here before. They've never pressed play on your episode, and they don't know you. They don't know the audience. They don't know nothing about the podcast. And we tend to lean towards the listeners who have been with us from episode 1 all the way through to 132, and we ignore the new listeners. So an intro has to embrace both a new listener and a seasoned listener for your show. You definitely need to keep them both in mind every time you hit record on your episode. An effective introduction will often include a teaser of something that's coming up in the content to captivate the audience interest. Again, let's get that phone put away, back into the computer bag, back into their pocket, whatever. So they put it down and they hit play and they listen to your show. That's the goal. We can use on-brand music or sound elements that enhance the overall appeal. I've had people say they like the music for this show, really simple. When they hit play, they know exactly what it is without looking at their phone. Oh, that's Dave's show. And it just becomes a natural thing. That's the familiarity of hearing the same thing on repeat. And for those that listen to batch listening, which I do, and I find a great podcast, I listen to every episode. And they play one after the other after the other. A little side tip, bonus tip for all you out there is to make sure that the ending of your podcast and the beginning of the next podcast, there's a flow between the two so that you're ending your music and then you're starting the next episode. So don't do the same call to action in the beginning and the end, because that means if we're going to binge listen, we're going to hear it multiple times back to back. And that's not a great listening experience. Keep that in mind. We always kind of tend to record in a bubble, thinking of just this episode, but also think about how your episodes stack up when somebody hits play and listens to 10 or 20 in a row of your show. It can happen. So just think about, what does that sound like for a listening audience? You don't want it to be boring or repetitive and the same thing over and over again. Think about what it sounds like when your show is listened back to back to back. Okay? Something to think about. Okay, so I have 6 key aspects to a successful intro. Number 1, a justification for listening. So for this one, Rach, what I would say is that your podcast intro should immediately showcase the value within the episode. Some kind of connection with the audience right away that brings us in. Think of a movie trailer when you go to watch the movies, right? And they play all those trailers at a time. They give you just enough of it to make you go, I want to see that movie. Your podcast intro should give a little bit of context about what's going to come in this episode to make people go, I love Rach's podcast. This is perfect. This episode is exactly what I want to listen to. And again, I can put my phone away and I'm going to listen to Rach's podcast. So make sure there's a justification for listening. That's number 1. Number 2, some sort of personal connection. So Rach, when I press play on your episode, make sure that there's a premise within the episode, a theme that hooks me as a listener, while kind of setting the tone for me to be engaged with what you want to talk about on your episode. Those are always great with little things like a question. Questions are always good. Have you ever wondered, have this ever happened to you? Do you struggle with this? Have you ever seen the movie, right? Have you ever felt like, those are questions that make me go, yeah, that's exactly who I am. That's what I'm dealing with right now. That's my struggle. That's my thought. That's my expertise. That's my challenge. Those are all a personal connection between the host and the listener. And what I would also say for anyone with an interview podcast is, again, even though you're on screen recording with a guest, don't forget your listener. Because if you don't welcome in the listener, if you don't engage the listener into the interview, they'll never be really fully connected with the content. So when you come on with a guest, remember, it's not about you as the host. Your interview is not about your guest. Really, even though they're there to talk about their book, their music, whatever, the thing they're promoting, it's about the listener. And if you as a host don't connect with the listener and your guest doesn't connect with the listener, you're going to have a hard time making that listener feel welcome and building that personal connection. So that's number 2. So you justify the listening of the episode, you connect with the person that's listening, and then number 3, you establish credibility. How do we establish credibility? It's very simple. Rachel, when you do your recording, just provide a brief overview of the podcast and maybe a little bit about the episode, the guest on your show. If you're doing an interviews-based podcast, please don't read their LinkedIn bio. Just put a link to their bio in the show notes. Just get right to it, right? So, Rach, if you were on my podcast, I wouldn't be telling everybody about your favorite food, where you grew up, that you were born at a very young age. None of that stuff. I wouldn't tell everybody where you went to school, what your grades were, when you got your first car, your favorite color, and what you wore at prom. Again, for the listener, they're like, Dave, can we just hear from Rach? Like, really, let's just get into the content. Again, you want people to put their phone away when they press play on your episode. So creating credibility is just to give an overview of the podcast, intro your guest, and then just demonstrate expertise as far as adding further incentive to continue listening. So on today's podcast, we're going to talk about A, B, and C, and this is what the show's about. So I'll give you an example. Okay, Rach, we're going to kind of take a side step here for a second. One of the podcasts I love listening to is by a great podcaster named Mel Robbins. Listen to how she intros her podcast, how she connects with the audience, introduces everything, sets herself up as a credible source, just as a side, so you can hear how her podcast starts. And Rach, if you've never heard her show, go and subscribe today and listen to every episode. You'll love it. So here's Mel Robbins, how she opens one of her most recent episodes.
I have been dying to tell you what happened when I was in New York City a couple weeks ago. The elevator doors close as she's going, come on. And the elevator goes down. My heart began to sink, and Kendall drops her head and puts her hands over her face. And then she pulls her hands by her side with 2 fists and lets out this blood-curdling scream. Hey, it's Mel, and I have been dying to talk to you because I have the greatest story to tell you. And I don't know how to say this without sounding like it's a big flex. So here goes. I'll just say it. Our daughter Kendall was invited to sing at Carnegie freaking Hall in New York City. And that's the beginning of this crazy story that I want to tell you that involves so many cool, hilarious things like how to stay calm when you're stressed, or the benefits of screaming in an elevator, the world's coolest pair of pants, and why you should never, and I mean never, try to film a performance at Carnegie Hall on your iPhone. You are going to love this story. You will laugh at my expense and adore the 4 life lessons that I learned that random night. These are 4 lessons that are going to help you act confident when you're stressed, be fearless under pressure, reach your potential, and unlock the magic in your life. So get ready for 4 lessons I learned recently on one random night in New York City. Let's do this.
So there you go. That's what I'm talking about right there. Talk about justifying the listen, personal connection, and establishing credibility. Okay, that's the Mel Robbins podcast. I love it. I'm not even her target audience, but I love the Mel Robbins podcast. It is amazing. So good. She's a great author as well. Some great audiobooks you need to go check out. Just go fall in love with Mel. She's amazing. So, Rach, that would be an example. If you want a deep dive understanding and a great example of how to start a podcast episode, that's it. That's it right there. Do that the way you want to do it in your words. And again, remember, Mel's been doing this for a long time, so don't think you have to start with the way she's doing it right now. But work your way into it. Take elements of what you heard Mel do right there and use that as a way to frame the intro to each of your episodes. And if possible, what I would suggest to you is to not have a canned intro that's the same every time you come to the mic. Because again, people will skip it. I listen to podcasts, a lot of podcasts, Rach, and there's some that I know that they don't get to the content to the 2-minute mark. So every time I listen to their show, I have to skip. Some of their episodes are only 7 minutes long. And 2 minutes is a bunch of stuff, fluff at the beginning and commercials and things and blah, blah, blah. But I know they start at the 2-minute mark, 2:03, 2:05. That's when they actually start talking about today's topic. So I have to sit there with my phone, especially if I listen to episodes back to back to back. Every time the new episode starts, I have to skip, right? Get to that 2-minute mark. So don't do that to your audience. Just jump in. Get ready to do it. That's the way Mel starts her show. I'm in. My phone is away. I'm ready to go. Okay? So again, justify the listen, personal connection, establish credibility, and the number 4, which you kind of heard from Mel just now, number 4 is to set the mood. Now, you don't have to use music in your podcast. It's not like a rule. Nobody's going to come and take away your podcast license if you don't use music. And using music can be complicated. It can be expensive. So don't think at all, Rich, that I'm telling you you have to have music, because you don't. Okay, you don't. You can do whatever you want. This is your podcast. And again, no one's going to take it away from you. So do whatever you want to do. Don't be influenced by everybody else. Okay, speaking as a musician, I love music, and it makes a tone for my show. If you listen to Dad Space, you'll hear my Dad Space music. Here, I'll give you a little clip of it right now while I'm talking. So my podcast for this, my intro for this show, Dad Space, I'll be like, hi, everybody, welcome to Dad Space. You know, the podcast for dads by dads. My name is Dave. Welcome to the show. Today, we're going to be talking about A, B, and C. And we want you to understand that you are a great dad. You're doing great dad things. And my guest today is Rach. Rach is on the show to talk about her book, All Things Dad. Rach, glad to have you here. Welcome to the show. That's it. See? So for the music, I love the music because it kind of gives me little things that I can play off of. Right now, I'm talking over top of it while I'm recording. So I'm listening to the music in the background. Kind of multitasking here. And I'm listening to the little things that happen within the music so that I can match my voice up to it when I do stuff like this. And then this. It's Dead Space. See? Kind of waited for that little change in the music. Yeah. And the music will pick up again here at the end. So that's stuff you can do. You can actually leverage the music. It sets the mood. So when you come to Dad Space, you know you're in Dad Space because this music is playing behind you. So you don't have to use music. It's not mandatory, but it does help to set the mood for your show. And that's the reason why I chose that music. It's not like screaming guitars. It's not polka. It's not country. It's not Beyonce's country music career, apparently. It's none of that stuff. It's just a simple, non-vocal track, just music to set the mood for my show. So add that in. Maybe if that's part of what you want to do for your brand, for your sound of your show, is leverage music, something like that. It's totally up to you, though. Number 5 is all about just being concise. There are those podcasts out there in podcast land that go for 3 hours, 4 hours, and they just keep going on and on and on. I don't have, personally, 4 hours to commit to a single podcast. I could listen to many podcasts within that time frame. So instead of giving all my attention to one person and committing to that kind of time frame, you can be concise in your podcast and even do like short little mini episodes. You don't have to follow the 3-hour rule to be a podcaster. Just putting that out there for you. So please, you have my permission. You don't have to do that. And just like we can have concise podcast episodes that don't have to be 3 hours long, your intro as well doesn't have to be 3 hours long. You can get concise, to the point, get to the podcast, get to the content. Again, give your listener every reason to put their phone away. Don't have them skipping through. Like I said, for that other podcast, I talk about every episode, I got to skip to the 2-minute mark. It's annoying to do that every single time. So be concise, make it short, to the point, get to it, off you go. Again, go back to Mel's sample I provided earlier. It's a great example about being concise, hooking you in. You want to hear the story about her daughter. You do. You want to. So we talked about a successful intro is going to be a justification for listening. That was number 1. Number 2, personal connection. We want to connect with our audience. Number 3, we want to establish credibility. Say it, Dave. Number 4, we want to be setting the mood. Number 5, we want to be concise. And lastly, to round it all out, an effective CTA. Now, what's a CTA? Again, we talked about it here in the past, but your first time here, welcome. CTA stands for call to action. Sometimes we do them at the end of the show. Go to my website, howtopodcast.ca, leave me a speak pipe message. I'd love to hear from you. That's a call to action. I'm asking you to do something because I want to connect with you and I want to hear your amazing voice and get you on the show. That's why I have it on my website. I'm not sending you to my Facebook or my Instagram. I'm sending you to my website because Facebook apparently goes down for no reason these days. My website, still there. Anytime, all the time, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Extra day on leap years. It's always there. So go to my website, howtopodcast.ca. We can do a CTA, a call to action, at the beginning of the podcast. You can do it there as well. Again, not everybody listens to the end as much as I admonish you to do so, because it does signal to all the listening apps and YouTube and everywhere that the content's worth listening to. If you stick around to the end, it's a great indication to Apple, to Spotify, and everybody else that this is a good podcast, because everybody who goes to this show sticks and stays there. So keep that in mind. You can do a call to action at the beginning if you want. Not necessary, not mandatory. And again, no one's coming to take away your podcast if you don't do it a certain way. So to support everything we've talked about so far, 3 things about crafting your podcast intro. When you're scripting out your podcast intro, and I would advise you to write it out, don't just kind of whatever comes off the top of your head, because it's not going to be concise. At least write it out a few times and wordsmith it a little bit, and then you don't have to read it, but at least you wrote it out, and now you know what you want to say, okay? But your 3 things to consider when scripting out your podcast, these fundamental principles should be there. Clearly state the podcast name and purpose. I'm working with a client, and they've given me multiple episodes to edit, and not once have they actually mentioned the name of their own show. So I reached out to them and said, hey, a little idea, maybe mention the show we're listening to. Oh, yeah. So it wasn't even in their mind. So clearly state the name of your podcast. Welcome to the How to Podcast series. My name is Dave. Do that right away. Number 2, provide a compelling reason for listeners to tune in. And number 3, introduce yourself and any guest. Again, establishing credibility and fostering audience connection. So Rach, again, ultimately, your podcast intro serves as a gateway to your content. Okay? It helps shape your listeners' initial impressions and influences their decision to stay engaged, put the phone away, and stick with your podcast. You want to be sticky. You want your podcast just to cling to them, all right? And so by following these practices, it's going to give your unique brand and your podcast some breath, some life. And you can create a captivating introduction that captivates and retains your audience by simply just following along on this, referring to other great podcasters that you listen to and go, I like a little bit of this person. I like a little bit of that person. And I'm going to take all these ingredients that I like, and I'm going to make my own recipe for my podcast intro. And if after you've done it for a few times and you're like, I want to change it, then go ahead and change it. You can do whatever you want. Again, Rach, don't let perfection stand in the way of producing an episode. The best way to get better at podcasting is to podcast. The hardest way to develop as a podcaster is to stop. You got to keep moving forward. You got to keep hitting record. And even if you're not super happy with it, you can always go back. You can always go back and change an episode. Episode 18 of the How to Podcast series, I talked about one topic, and then I went back just recently and I re-recorded the entire episode, re-uploaded it. So if you've listened to episode 18 in the past, the new version of episode 18 is there. If you're interested, it's a totally different episode, because what I talked about in that episode no longer served you or future listeners. So I go in and just change it. No big deal. So you can always go back and change your intros. And if you have any other questions, hopefully you found a few nuggets in here. Maybe Mel inspired you. Maybe you found something that we talked about here on the show that inspired you. But I'd love to hear your intro. Again, you can just call in with my SpeakPipe link and just read to me your intro. If you want, you can set up time in my calendar, Rach, and we'll get together and talk about your podcast. And maybe we'll just, work together and craft a great intro for your show. I would love to help you. Okay, I'm always here for you and anyone else that leaves a message here on the How to Podcast series, howtopodcast.ca. And remember, there's the questions attached to the episodes on most of the apps that you're going to be listening to this. Go ahead, click the button, leave me a message, respond to the polls, respond to the question, and I'll create an episode just for you, just like I did for Rach as well. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for being here. howtopodcast.ca, call to action happening right now. Go there, leave me a message. I'd love to hear from you on the SpeakPipe, email, calendar link, everything's there for you. I would love to talk to you. I really, really would. It would be great because you're great and I'd like to meet great people. So reach out, let me know. I'd love to talk to you. Thanks for being here. Go and create a great intro and then share it with me so I can celebrate and share it with everyone else. And Mel Robbins, you are awesome. Take care. Hey, thank you for sticking all the way through to the very end. It's bittersweet that the episode is over and that we're done for this episode, but you will come back and I will come back. And, there's you and me and we're one big happy family here at the How to Podcast series, far beyond being just pod pals, which is fine, but I'd much rather do life together as family here. And to that end, a reminder as we talked earlier in other episodes as well, that we do have a meetup group and you are invited. I would love to have you come. It's free. We do them scattered throughout our calendar, different days, different times, because we have people listening around the world like Cuba and Warsaw, Poland. Hi, Cuba. It's amazing how we can reach the world with a podcast. So through our meetup group, what we do is we get together. It's free for you. Cost me money, but that's okay. I'm okay with that. We get together, we meet other podcasters, we talk podcasting, and it's a way to get from behind the microphone, sitting by ourselves, recording on our own, and doing community. Podcasters need community. You need to meet other podcasters. And just in a low-key, fun environment, talk podcasting. So my challenge to you in 2024 and beyond is to get into a meetup group, find other podcasters, introduce yourself and make new friends. It's just like school all over again, grade 9. Let's meet each other and share the podcast journey. Go to howtopodcast.ca and click on all the information you'll find there around our meetups. And I'd love to have you there. Thanks for listening. Catch you on the next episode. Get out there and record your podcast. Take care.